It begins not with a war cry, but with a groan. The heavy, grinding sound of massive wooden gates creaking open, echoing across a silent plain. There is no clash of bronze, no rain of arrows, no screams of dying men. Just the eerie, suffocating silence of a city holding its breath. For 250 years, the warring states had soaked the soil of China in blood, a ceaseless storm of fire and iron. But here, at the gates of Linzi, the capital of the final kingdom, the storm suddenly stopped. The state of Qi was the wealthiest, the most populous, and the last remaining rival to the terrifying power of Qin. Yet, it did not fall in a glorious last stand. It fell without a single major battle. It was a conquest so swift, so strange, and so psychologically devastating that history records it as a collapse of the spirit. How did the strongest economy of the era, a kingdom that had watched its neighbors die for decades, dissolve overnight? Welcome back to the History Atlas. Today, we witness the final stroke of the unification wars, the masterstroke of General Wang Ben, and the tragedy of a king who realized too late that the price of peace is often higher than the price of war. To understand the tragedy of Qi, one must first look away from the battlefield and into the opulent halls of Linzi. By the year 221 before the Common Era, the land all under heaven had been screaming in agony for centuries. The Warring States period was a grinding mill of flesh and ambition, where the states of Han, Zhao, Wei, Chu, and Yan were systematically butchered by the black-armored legions of Qin. But in the east, the state of Qi stood eerily silent. It was a silence bought with gold and fueled by a comfortable delusion. For 40 years, while the rest of China burned, the people of Qi listened not to war drums, but to the delicate plucking of zither strings and the rustling of fine embroidered silks. Qi was the wealthiest of the 7 states, a commercial giant resting on the fertile eastern coast, known for its salt, iron, and vibrant culture. Yet, its survival was not due to military might, but to a seductive diplomatic poison administered by Qin. The strategy of far attack. Near befriend. The Qin strategists had convinced the Qi court that if they simply did nothing, if they remained neutral spectators to the slaughter of their neighbors, they would be spared. It was a masterclass in geopolitical isolation. Like a wealthy merchant locking his doors while wolves devoured the village, Qi watched the other 5 kingdoms fall, one by one. They saw the fires of Handan in the distance. They heard the refugees from Wei begging at their borders. But the gates of Linzi remained shut, and its armies remained in their barracks, fat and unbloodied. King Jian of Qi, the last ruler of this ancient lineage, believed he had purchased peace. He did not see that he had only purchased being eaten last. The court officials congratulated themselves on their prudence, looking out from their high terraces at the smoke rising in the west, grateful it was not their own fields burning. But this prosperity was a hallucination. The peace was merely the calm of a butcher sharpening his knife while the livestock grazed. By remaining a bystander, Qi had allowed Qin to dismantle the only thing that could have saved them, a united alliance. Now, the buffer states were gone. The wolves were no longer fighting in the distant valleys. They were gathering, tens of thousands strong, right at the garden gate. While the Qin army sharpened its blades, the Qin treasury was busy dulling the minds of its enemies. The conquest of Qi was not initially paved with soldiers' bodies, but with the heavy, persuasive weight of gold. At the heart of this invisible war stood King Jian, a ruler whose indecision would become his epitaph. But behind the throne stood the true architect of Qi's demise, the chancellor, Hu Sheng. Hu Sheng was the most dangerous kind of traitor, the one who spoke with the voice of reason. For years, agents from the Qin capital of Xianyang had been ferrying carts of gold and jewels into Hu Sheng's private estates. In exchange, the chancellor whispered sweet poison into the king's ear. When the desperate envoys from the state of Zhao arrived, kneeling and begging for reinforcements to stop the Qin advance, it was Hu Sheng who dismissed them, counseling the king that one does not burn one's own house to save a neighbor's. When the vertical alliance attempted one final, desperate unification to crush Qin, it was Hu Sheng who dismantled the talks, ensuring Qi remained absent. It was a masterstroke of espionage. The Qin strategists understood that the jagged terrain of the mind was harder to conquer than any mountain pass. They turned the Qi court into a theater of comfortable lies. King Jian, surrounded by sycophants paid by his enemy, sat on a throne that was already rotting from beneath him. He was led to believe that Qin was a respectful ally, not a predator. The sound of treason in Lindsay was not a shout, but the soft, metallic clinking of foreign coins exchanging hands in dimly lit backrooms, buying the silence of an entire nation. By the time the smoke cleared from the ruins of the other 5 states, Qi stood in terrible, splendid isolation. The buffer zones were gone. The alliances were dead memories. The gold had done its work, stripping Qi of its friends, its vigilance, and its honor. Now, the Qin war machine, bloated with the resources of a conquered continent, finally turned its gaze east. The time for bribery was over. The time for iron had arrived. With the diplomatic web spun tight, the first emperor unleashed his final hound. The command of the invasion was not given to the old guard, but to General Wang Ben. He was a man driven by a ferocious, personal hunger. As the son of the legendary Wang Jian, the conqueror of the colossal state of Chu, Wang Ben lived in a shadow that stretched across the empire. To carve his own name into the stone of history, he needed a victory that was not just absolute, but blindingly fast. He did not want a siege. He wanted a decapitation. The army that marched at his back was no longer a mere collection of conscripts. After a decade of constant warfare, the Qin military had evolved into a terrifying, industrial machine of death. These were veterans who had walked through the ashes of 5 fallen kingdoms. They wore the black lamellar armor of the Qin dynasty, a dark ocean of iron that absorbed the sunlight. When they marched, they did not sing. The only sound was the rhythmic, chest-rattling thumping of thousands of boots hitting the earth in unison. a vibration that could be felt through the soles of the feet long before the banners came into view. The generals of Qi, shaking off their stupor, rushed to man their defenses. They looked to the west. For generations, the state of Qi had maintained a formidable line of fortifications along its western and southern borders. The Great Wall of Qi. It was a masterpiece of military engineering, designed to break the wave of any invading host coming from the Qin heartland. The Qi commanders were confident that if Wang Ben threw his legions against those walls, he would bleed for months. But Wang Ben was a student of the new way of war. He knew that hitting a stone wall with a fist was foolish when you could simply walk around it. The generals of Qi were not incompetent. They were simply fighting a war that no longer existed. Their eyes were fixed on the traditional invasion routes to the west and south, where the stone ramparts of the Qi Great Wall snaked across the ridgelines. These walls had held back the tides of war for centuries. But Wang Ben was holding a map that had changed. The state of Yan, to the north of Qi, had already fallen to his father's armies. The northern border, once shared with a fellow sovereign state, was now shared with the Qin Empire. And it was wide open. In a maneuver that would be studied for generations, Wang Ben turned his back on the fortified western front. He drove his army north into the conquered territory of Yan. It was a silent tiger hunt, a forced march of punishing speed through the rugged, less traveled terrain of the northern frontier. The Qin soldiers, accustomed to the brutal discipline of the legalist state, moved like ghosts through the mist. They abandoned heavy supply trains for speed, dragging their chariots through mud and biting winds, crossing rivers that the Qi commanders believed were natural barriers. The terrain here was not a wall of stone, but a wilderness of neglect. The Qi defenses in the north were sparse, relying on the assumption that no army could move fast enough through the Yan lands to pose a threat before being spotted. They were wrong. Wang Ben did not just march. He raced against the flow of information. He severed the roads and captured the scouts before they could scream a warning. The entire western defense line, with its tens of thousands of soldiers and stockpiles of weapons, was rendered instantly obsolete. They were guarding a front door that no one was knocking on, while the roof was being torn off above their heads. The dawn broke, not with sunlight, but with the gleam of enemy spears. The vanguard of Wang Ben's army appeared on the northern horizon of Lindsay like a rising black tide. The shock was absolute. For the citizens of the capital, the war was supposed to be a distant rumor, something happening on the far side of the Great Wall. Now, it was staring them in the face. Panic swept through the streets of Lindsay faster than any fire. The disciplined order of the market squares dissolved into a stampede. The air, once filled with the scent of spices and roasting meat, now reeked of cold sweat and the acrid smoke of hastily burned documents. Alarm bells rang out from the watchtowers, clanging frantically, without rhythm, screaming the terror of a city that knew it was already dead. Inside the palace, King Jian sat paralyzed. His vast armies were massed on the western border, days of hard marching away. The capital was naked. He turned to his trusted chancellor, Hu Sheng. the man who had promised him that neutrality would be their shield. But the shield had turned into a cage. The gold that had bought peace had actually bought a defenseless throat for the executioner. There was no time to recall the generals. There was no time to levy a militia. The betrayal was total. The peace was a lie. Then, a single chariot detached from the Qin lines and rode toward the city gates. It carried no siege engine, no battering ram, only a messenger. Wang Ben sent a message to the king that was not a threat of war, but a promise of survival, or so the king thought. The gates of Lindsay opened again, but this time, the sound was the death rattle of an era. In the year 221 before the Common Era, King Jian of Qi, the ruler of the East, walked out of his city not as a monarch, but as a prisoner. He did not wear his battle armor. He wore the plain robes of submission. In his hands, he carried the royal seal of Qi, a heavy jade block that represented centuries of history, lineage, and the mandate of heaven. He knelt before Wang Ben and offered it up, believing that his compliance would buy him mercy. He believed that, like the fallen lords of old, he would be given a small fiefdom, a title, and the right to live out his days in comfort. He was wrong. The Qin did not want vassals. They wanted erasure. The kingdom of Qi was immediately abolished, its name struck from the administrative maps and replaced with a mere commandery of the empire. As for King Jian, his mercy was a cruel joke. He was not executed by the sword. He was exiled to a place called Gong, a desolate region far from the comforts of his palace. There, he was placed in a small dwelling surrounded by a dense forest of pine and cypress trees. A pine forest prison where the silence was absolute. The irony was perfect and terrible. The king, who had refused to send grain to the starving citizens of Zhao, the king who had hoarded the wealth of the world's most prosperous state, was left to rot. The Qin provided him with no servants and no food. The wealthiest man in China, who had once dined on delicacies from every corner of the land, spent his final days clawing at the earth, drinking rainwater, and listening to the wind howl through the pines. He died of starvation, alone in the cold shadows of the trees. His death was the final punctuation mark of the Warring States period. The last kingdom had not fallen in a blaze of glory. It had withered away, hungry and forgotten. The collapse of Qi serves as the ultimate historical validation of Sun Tzu's most famous axiom. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. While historians often focus on the blood-soaked battlefields of Changping or the flooded ruins of Daliang, the conquest of Qi was arguably Qin's most brilliant campaign because it was won before the first soldier even put on his boots. Qi's defeat was not a failure of military hardware. It was a catastrophic failure of grand strategy. For decades, the warring states had been locked in a deadly game of alliances. The only check against Qin's rising power was the vertical alliance, the concept that the 6 weaker states must unite to form a shield wall against the West. But Qin countered with the horizontal alliance, using bribery and terror to break that shield apart. Qi was the linchpin. By accepting Qin's gold and refusing to aid the dying states of Zhao and Wei, Qi believed it was purchasing safety. In reality, it was dismantling its own buffer zones. The tactical lesson here is brutal. In a system of total war, isolationism is suicide. Qi's selfishness was its death warrant. They allowed Qin to fight a series of one-on-one wars, digesting each rival piecemeal, until the grand host of Qin was larger than any force Qi could muster alone. When Wang Bin finally marched, he wasn't facing a rival empire. He was facing a lonely, demoralized remnant. The end of the state did not come with the roar of a collapsing wall, but with the quiet scratch of a brush against bamboo. A Qin scribe simply struck the name Qi from the list of living nations and wrote Yingchuan Commandery in its place. The map was no longer a patchwork of colors. It was a single, terrifying block of black. The era of the warring states was over. But as the dust settled, the world held its breath. The chaos was gone. But what replaced it was something the world had never seen before. With the fall of Qi, the world did not just change maps. It changed eras. King Yingzheng of Qin stood atop the ruins of 6 kingdoms, looking out over a land that was finally silent. He decided that the title of king was too small for what he had achieved. It belonged to the past, to the chaotic age of division. He reached back into the mists of mythology and combined the titles of the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors to create a new name: Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of Qin. The unification went far deeper than borders. For the first time in history, all under heaven was bound by a single will. The first emperor tore down the walls that divided the minds of his people. He abolished the feudal system that had caused centuries of war, replacing it with a centralized bureaucracy where officials were promoted by talent, not birth. He commanded that all carts must have axles of the same length, that all merchants must use the same bronze coins, and that all scholars must write with the same script. The chaos of diversity was replaced by the terrifying efficiency of order. Yet, this new world was forged in cold iron. The peace that settled over China was not the gentle peace of a spring morning. It was the heavy, suffocating peace of a prison cell. The legalist laws were absolute. Dissent was crushed. The price of unity was the death of freedom. In the imperial palace, the emperor commissioned the Great Seal of the Realm, carved from the legendary He clan jade. On it, the Prime Minister Li Si inscribed 8 characters. Having received the mandate from heaven, may the emperor lead a long and prosperous life. They believed this empire would last for 10,000 generations. They were wrong. The Qin dynasty would collapse in just 15 years, consumed by the very fires of rebellion it had tried to extinguish. But the dream of a unified China, the idea that the land between the seas should be one indivisible whole, would survive for 2,000 years. The warring states were over. The imperial age had begun. But as the first emperor sought the elixir of immortality, the shadows of his conquered enemies were already gathering in the dark. If you enjoyed this journey through the wars that forged China, please subscribe to our channel to relive heroic chapters of history with us. The sword is sheathed for now, but the story of the Qin is far from over. Next, we will witness how this colossus, built on blood and iron, began to crack from within.